our next talk will be, we move in from English to Hebrew, and now we're going to learn a little bit about fluency in Finnish. And I'm very happy that we have Dr. Mikko Aro, I hope I pronounced it correctly, from Jyväskylä University in Finland, who will give us the talk about training reading fluency in Finnish. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and professor presidents for this wonderful opportunity to participate in this conference. It's my first time in Israel, but I'm sure it won't be the last one, hopefully. My topic today is training reading fluency in Finnish, and I'm not going to talk to you about brain research because that's not something that I'm nowadays involved much anymore. And since we have two presentations from the Finnish context in a row here, I think I'll start by giving you a short course in Finnish, an overview of the peculiarities and features and idiosyncrasies of the Finnish language and orthography that make reading fluency especially important from the Finnish point of view, I think. Okay. So I'll talk a bit about Finnish language, and then I'll describe a couple of studies that we've been carrying out, concentrating on treatment of sublexical units. And in the case of Finnish, we have concentrated on syllable as a sublexical unit. And those are repeated reading experiments I'm going to talk to you about, and I'll finish by summarizing some of the ongoing projects that are related to fluency-related issue that we are currently active with. So I'll start with the Finnish. As you know, it's a very small language. Altogether, there are only around 5 million native speakers of Finnish. It's mostly speaking in Finland, but also in neighboring countries there are small native minorities of Finnish speakers, Sweden, Norway, Western Russia, actually. As you might know, Finnish is kind of a Greek language, at least in the European context. It's not an Indo-European language, it doesn't belong to that language family, but it's part of the Finno-Ugric or Uralic language family. And it's a separate language family with a number of quite small languages, the largest being Hungarian, which is a distant relative of Finnish, and the third largest being Estonian, which is quite close relative to Finnish. Samic languages belong to the same language family as Finnish also. And what's typical to all Finno-Ugric languages is that they have agglutinative morphology, which means that there are not much pre or postpositions, but instead inflectional endings. And for example, in the case of Finnish, you can have a number of inflectional endings in the words, making the words quite long. Finno-Ugric languages typically have also a large set of grammatical cases. They lack grammatical gender. Finnish, for example, has no gender even for third person pronoun, which is nice from the equality point of view, I think. And as you might notice from my accent, Finno-Ugric languages have stress on the first syllable. And I think it's evident also in my English. When you think about schooling in Finland, the school starts the year children turn 7 years. There's no formal reading instruction before that point at preschool. And the reading instruction methods actually quite universally in Finland concern synthetic phonics instruction. And the method most commonly used would be translated into English as letter phoneme syllable word method, which means that the teaching universally starts with the letter phoneme correspondences. Then there's practice in assembly syllables and then words. And the speed of reading instruction proceeds roughly with the rate of 1 letter per week from the school entry. And typically the phonemic assembly is based on syllables, so syllables are used as a substage of decoding in reading instruction. The early reading materials are syllabificated, so as you might notice, the syllables are quite sort of integral part of Finnish reading instruction. And the beginning readers read a lot of syllable lists, words, and then short passages. Reading and spelling instruction starts at the same time, at the beginning of the first grade. And this Finnish school system has quite extensive part-time special needs education system. From early on, actually, they start screening children for possible problems already during the first month at school. And the statistics show that actually close to 1/3 of Finnish children in compulsory education receive part-time special needs education at some point during the school year. So that's quite a big number. It's actually close to 30% in the last statistics. Then one sort of cultural notion, we have subtitles on television, which I think has been one of the great feats for Finnish literacy skills when the decision was made not to dub TV programs but use subtitles. Youngsters watch television close to 10 hours per week, and most of the most popular TV programs they watch are of foreign origin and have subtitles, and you can estimate that close to 10 hours per week of watching television corresponds to 20 books per year. So that's quite big number, big amount of reading you get by just watching television, without understanding that you're actually practicing your reading skills, which is quite nice. The Finnish phonological system is quite simple and straightforward. We have 24 phonemes, 8 vowel sounds, 16 consonant sounds, and 3 of these consonant sounds are not actually of Finnish origin. They are used only in recent loanwords like banaani, galleria, or faara, which I think I don't need to translate. There are 18 diphthongs in Finnish, and traditionally Finnish diphthongs are not analyzed as phonemes, but phoneme sequences. So, for example, a name like Heikki, it has 5 sounds. E and I are separate sounds, although they form a diphthong in Finnish. One aspect of Finnish phonology is vowel harmony, which is kind of morphophonological feature. In words, we have either front or back vowels within a root and suffixes. Vowel sounds E and E are neutral, so they can exist in both cases, with back vowels or front vowels. And as you might all know, one sort of distinctive feature of Finnish is the phoneme quantity. All phonemes can have short and long quantities, with the exception of 4 sounds actually. And what it means is that we can have words like taka, taka, takka, takka, taakka, and taakka. It's all different as you noticed. They sound different and they mean different things. Backside, from behind, fireplace. Fireplace, quality, form, burden, and so on. Just the quantity or length of the pronunciation or the stop in the case of stop consonants. The syllable structure is fairly simple. We have mostly open syllables and altogether only 10 different syllable structures, the most complex being 4-phonemic CD-CC syllable structure. The prosody in Finnish is syllable-based. The The main stress, as I mentioned, is on first syllable, and we have side stress on third syllable. So again, a spoken language syllable is a salient unit, so a salient perceptual unit actually. The open syllables, we cleverly sort of finish foreign words like bank or post by adding vowel to the end, having the open syllable, and it's a Finnish word, pankki, post. We have very few consonant clusters as opposed to, for example, Germanic languages. Clusters can exist only in syllable coders, and initial clusters you can have only in recent loan words like traktori or strategia. And typically in colloquial spoken language, these clusters are simplified, so we might speak about rattori and rategia. Again, when we go into morphology, things get a bit more tricky, since Finnish has fairly rich and complex agglutinative inflectional system, which means that, for example, when you have a noun, any single noun can have 15 different cases and case endings, marking the case. You have, of course, singular plural forms, and then you have 6 possessive suffixes, and then you have these small additional clitics. And basically what you do is just add these endings to the end of the noun, and you get a new word which is considerably longer than the root. So when the poor English-speaking people have to use 5 words for saying not even in our houses, we can handily say taloissammekaan, which means exactly the same thing. Or indeed, after we have shown, we can say näytettyämme hän. And I'm not sure if you see that I emphasized the sort of morphemes with different colors. That's not the way we do it in Finnish normally, it's just for presentation purposes. But you can see that the words contain a lot of morphological information, and they tend to be quite long because of the inflectional system. Just to give you a glimpse of the cases, or the case system, when you have a singular nominative word like jalka, you have actually 15 different cases, accusative, genitive, partitive, and so on. We learn these by 5th grade in primary school, and we have to be able to inflect the words in all these cases. And this is just a small amount of all the possible word forms you can have actually for any root or lexeme. There's also, related to this complex morphology, what makes it a bit more tricky and sort of not so rule-based is that there are features like fusionality, gradation, and vowel harmony that affect the roots of the word. So if you inflect a word like lammas, there's fusionality, which means that only 3 first letters are the same in the inflected form. Lammas, lampaan. Gradation means shortening or getting rid of the consonant, stop consonant sound. Tuki, tuen in inflected form. Tukki, tukin, where there's gemination disappears. And vowel harmony means that when you add this inflected ending in a word, you have to take into account whether the word consists of front or back vowels. So yeah, talossa, but kylässä. And the SSA, or with 2 dots on it, represent the same case, but the ending is different because of vowel harmony. If this sounds complex, it actually is pretty complex. On top of this inflectional morphology, Finnish has quite rich derivational system and productive compounding. And it has been estimated that about 1/4 of all words are either derivations or compounds. So again, the economical way of saying a bottle of blackcurrant juice in Finnish is mustaviinimarjankopullo, which is 1 word instead of 5. And as examples of derivation system, we have words like kirja, kirjailija, kirjasto, kirjoittaa, kirjallisuus, which refer to book, author, library, to write, literature. All derivations from the word book. So a single root can actually be present in a huge number of sort of orthographic context and orthographic forms, various and numerous. About Finnish orthography, Finnish is actually quite young orthography. The first book in Finnish was published in the mid of 16th century, which was actually ABC book for children. I don't think that's really very typical, but that's the case, at least in Finnish. Our alphabet is a Swedish variant of Latin alphabet, having 29 letters, where 23 single letter graphemes are. We have 23 single letter graphemes, and then we have one phoneme that's marked with a Y graph, long eng sound. But all these correspondences are bidirectionally regular. Then we have a bunch of letters that we use only in citation loans, like names, C, Q, W, and so on. And as I mentioned, Finnish is one of the most regular alphabetic orthographies. There are no really exceptions. It's bidirectionally regular. And the long phonemic quantity, which might be sort of phonologically tricky, it's fairly simple orthographically because it is always marked by doubling the corresponding letter. So, the Finnish words tend to be quite long and polysyllabic. The mean length of words in text is around 8 letters, and when you look at dictionary items, it's even longer. It's about 10 letters, the mean length. And we have fairly small amount of monosyllabic words, as you might have concluded already, less than 50. And most of them are interjections, and quite rarely used. And we also tend to adapt the loan words into Finnish, like pizza. It was brought to Finland from Italy. It was written with double Z's. Nowadays it's perfectly legal to write it as it's pronounced in Finnish with TS. Same goes with ketsuppi and taksi. So to summarize, in text, words have a large number of possible forms depending on the sort of morphemic structure and morphemic load. And it has been calculated that nouns, when you take into account case endings and plural marker and possessive suffixes and all these small clitics, any single noun can have over 2,000 possible forms, of which 150 are pretty frequent. So it means that the singular nominative form is not necessarily the most frequent form of an item in texts. For verbs, this figure is even higher. It's over 10,000 forms. And when you take into account the derivation and system and compounding, you can say that the number of orthographic forms is, in some cases, close to astronomical, actually, where you can find a certain root in certain form in text. There are 2 exceptions to the strict phonemic principle in Finnish. The one is related to quite typical sandhi or assimilation phenomenon. We say otampa, but we spell NP, and we say kenkä with eng sound, but it's spelled with NK. And another exception to the phonemic principle is the predictive gemination between word or morpheme boundaries, which is something that you'll actually, as a Finn, you become aware when you study linguistics, because it's so common and you don't pay attention to it. But we write tule tänne with one T, although we pronounce tule tänne with a long T sound. I'm not really convinced if you hear the difference. But tännekin instead of tännekin. But these are minor exceptions and they don't affect the meaning. You will be perfectly understood. Perhaps sound a bit funny if you don't pay attention to this predictive gemination. So in sum, you can say that Finnish phonological system is simple, morphological system is complex and somewhat opaque, orthographic system is based on phonemic principle, and the morphemic structure is actually not salient in writing, as it is, for example, in many cases in English. For example, the plural marker in Finnish nouns can be T at the end of the word, or it can be J letter or letter I somewhere in between, or not necessarily, or never actually at the end of the word item. So it's not easy to see where the morphological structure purely on the basis of orthography. And what's important from the point of view of fluency is that words tend to be long and they have a lot of morphological information, so you have to be quite careful in decoding the items to not miss some information that's built in the word in the form of perhaps one letter morpheme somewhere. And all this means that when you have simple correspondences between phonemes and graphemes, and small number of phonemes and graphemes in the language, and you have long words with complex morphological structures, it means that gaining fluency is the major challenge for struggling readers. The Finnish children tend to be quite accurate already. Actually, 1/3 or close to half of the children are quite accurate readers when they enter the school without a single day of formal reading instruction, and the rest of the bunch typically learns the decoding or accurate decoding in a few weeks or a few months at the beginning of first grade. But some children and children with reading problems, they struggle with fluency. And just to sort of give you an idea, I hope you can see the figure. That's a scatter plot of JLD sample, or the longitudinal dyslexia study sample in Jyväskylä, where the children at the second grade diagnosed to be dyslexic are marked with red circles, quite poorly visible, and normal readers are marked with black plus marks. And the point is to show that when you look at the x-axis where you have the accuracy of this text reading task, you can see that there's a quite large overlap between the dyslexic sample and the normal readers. And there are actually very few dyslexic children who make more than 20% of errors in the text reading task, and typically the errors are omissions of these small clitics at the end of the word that don't affect comprehension. But when you look at the vertical axis where you have the text reading speed, you can see that there's a lot less overlap, and the dyslexic sample seems to be on the absolute slower end of the continuum and more consistently than from the point of view of accuracy. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to concentrate on syllable as a unit of automatization in Finnish when treating fluency. As you know, repeated reading has been used in fluency training with words and passages typically, but quite rarely with sublexical units. And the most common finding, or the typical finding in repeated reading practices is that, or studies, is that the reading of practiced items is typically enhanced, but the effects seem to be item-specific or word-specific in the case of words. So the children learn what they have been sort of taught. The effects don't seem to generalize outside the set of practiced items. And if you consider the features of Finnish, if you have item-specific effects, it would not be very useful, possibly, to use repeated reading practices with one of 2,000 different word forms. Because if you train the singular nominative form of word table, pöytä, you wouldn't see transfer to words pöydät, pöydässä, pöydissä, pöydällä, and so on and so forth. The inflected forms of the word table. But if you have item-specific effects and you concentrate on automatizing the syllable recognition, when you train the syllable pöyd, you can see transferring all of these inflected forms that share the initial syllable of pöyd. And of course the same syllable exists also in other items, word items also. So you could expect more generalized effects at word level, if you could automatize syllable recognition. The syllable structure in Finnish is relatively simple, which makes this sort of a bit more lucrative task. And also, if you look at 50 most frequent syllables in Finnish, they actually comprise 50% of all syllables in the texts. And also, the total number of different syllables in Finnish is fairly limited. It's the maximum number of possible syllables is 3,000, and actually the most frequent ones fit into 2,000 actually. And as I mentioned, syllables are perceptually salient units of the spoken language. And the syllable level is explicitly marked already in the early reading materials and ABC books of children until the 2nd grade. And they also, the children are also instructed to use syllable as a substage of decoding in the early stages of reading instruction. So our first study was a quasi-experimental training study where we had 36 slow readers from grade levels 4 to 6. We formed 2 training groups and used switching replications design. So one group waited for the intervention and the other one was intervened, and they switched roles after that. The treatment or training was fairly simple. They had repeated training sessions. They had to read infrequent syllables, altogether 30 of them in daily sessions, lasting 5 to 10 minutes. And they had 10 consecutive sessions, so the whole period lasted for 2 weeks, altogether from 50 to 100 minutes. And during one session, they received 5 repetitions of these target syllables, and that makes altogether 50 repetitions of each syllable during this intervention. And this study was published by Sini Huomer in 2010 in Scientific Studies of Reading. When you look at the results, you can see that the repeated reading increased the reading speed of practiced syllables, which is of course not surprising, and that's what we expected. The intervention periods in these graphs is emphasized with red color for both groups. And what was more interesting was that the training seemed to have an effect also on reading speed of pseudowords, but pseudowords that included the trained practiced syllables. So we were interested to see if you see a transfer from small units to larger units, and that seemed to be the case. We used pseudowords since the syllables selected for practice were infrequent, and we couldn't find actually frequent words with infrequent syllables, so we ended up having pseudowords as a measure of this transfer to larger units. When you look at the text reading task, you don't see actually any treatment effect, and that's what we predicted, since the text we had consisted no practiced syllables. So there were no practiced syllables within these short texts. So the effect seems to be specific to trained items, the syllables and the pseudowords that include the trained syllable, and it's not a sort of general training effect. It seems to be really specific and due to syllable practice. Then we had another study to find out more about this meaning or the effects of syllable training, and we were interested whether the fact that you have emphasis on either speed or accuracy during the training have an effect upon the outcome. And we were also interested whether the training is specific to syllable as a unit, or whether it's just related to automatization of in decoding the letter combinations you encounter in practice, during practicing. We had 23 children participating from grades 3 to 5. They were all slow readers, as in previous study, also below the 10th percentile of the age group. We formed 2 groups, speed group and accuracy group, and the only difference between these groups was that the they had different instruction, the one stressing the necessity of, or the relevance of being accurate, and the other stressing the point being fast in recognizing the syllables during practice. And they also received feedback on either speed or accuracy in respective groups. Also, a subsample of children participated in eye tracking assessment before and after the training. So we screened the children at 2 groups, and we had 2 pre-tests during, in between which there were no practice. Then we had a practice session and a post-test. The training was fairly simple. They had to read these one by one presenting syllables on a screen of a computer. We had again the same 30 infrequent syllables, 3 to 4 letters we used, and 5 repetitions, 10 sessions on consecutive school days, and altogether 50 repetitions per syllable. But we had more complex measures this time. We had 3 different syllable and pseudoword lists for assessing the transfer effects. We had a list of practiced syllables, then we had a list of neighboring syllables where the bigraphs or the triplets of letters were maintained, but one letter was exchanged, and then we had a control syllable list where there were no common bigraphs with the trained items. We also had corresponding pseudoword lists, so that we had pseudowords that included the practiced syllables, neighboring syllables, or these control syllables. And about the effect on the sort of instructional set or a type of feedback given to the children, you can summarize that there were no effects of instructional feedback emphasis on speed or accuracy in any of these syllable or pseudoword reading tasks. So the further results are presented for combined groups. Again, this training effect is quite clear for the practiced syllables, and what's I think interesting is that you see no effect on neighboring syllables or control syllables, which means that the training effect really seems to be specific to syllable as a unit, not to letter combinations or letter clusters. Again, you find the same treatment effect on the pseudowords, including the practiced syllables, and no transfer to these neighbor syllables or other control syllables at all. And again, you don't see effects when the children read a text where there are no practiced syllables included. For the subsample that participated in our eye movement study, you can say that when you look at the gaze duration, the length of the gaze for the item, you see effect of practice, so that the gaze is shortened most with practiced syllables, and it's shortened most in the pseudowords where these practice syllables are included. You get pretty similar finding when you look at the number of eye movement fixations on this syllable and pseudoword reading task. You get an effect on number of fixations in the syllable reading task, but in the pseudoword reading task you don't get this treatment, or it's not significant in pseudowords. And to summarize, it seems that repeated reading training with 50 repetitions increases reading speed of practiced syllables in slow readers. And this training increased speed also when the children were reading pseudowords when they included practiced syllables. So you can say that there's a transfer effect from small units to larger units, and in this case, syllables to pseudowords. But the effect is item specific on syllable level. So the children become more fluent when they have exactly the same syllable in reading materials that they have practiced and become automatized in reading. And it seems that in syllable reading, in fairly simple reading task, the effect is based on repetition not explicit emphasis on speed or accuracy during the practice in this case. And the eye movement data that was congruent with behavioral data, both case duration and number fixation was reduced in practiced syllables, and case duration was reduced most in those pseudowords that include practiced syllables. So to conclude, these are actually experimental studies masked to look like intervention studies, but we conclude that syllable seems to be a promising target for fluency training, at least in a language like Finnish, where the sublexical units are really salient from the point of view of phonology and also orthography. And after these studies, we have implemented syllable training in the context of grapho game program. So in Finnish we have grapho game fluency. I don't really know about the other languages yet. And if you're interested, you can take a look at the study of Mikko Aro, which was published lately in Scientific Studies of Reading, about this computer-based or graphic game-based intervention of syllable reading and its effects. Heikkilä used larger set of items than we did in our studies, and of course the game-like graphic game context is a lot motivating than a gray screen where you have white syllable and you have to read it a lot. I have to admit that syllable practice is really, really boring. So you need really to have a motivating environment to implement it in a sort of sensible way. And to summarize the findings in this grapho game study are largely corresponding to the findings that I presented in these two more experimental studies we carried out. So to talk to you to end and talk a bit about the other research that we are carrying out with respect to reading fluency, I can say very cautiously a few words about our preliminary findings of Finnish RAP study, since we have been able to translate and adapt the RAP into Finnish context, and we are keen to continue the work. We have carried out a pilot study where we had altogether 43 slow readers from grades 3 to 6, and the intervention period was quite short. It was only 9 training sessions during 3 to 4 school weeks, and the children read 32 sentences per session. When you look at the pre- and post-assessment findings within the program, you see that there's a significant increase of reading rate of sentences within the context of the program. You have also relatively good level, or actually very good level of comprehension also in the post-test, which means that the reading rate is not due to poor comprehension or sloppy reading. But what's sort of interesting that we have to analyze further is that there seems to be quite a lot of individual variation in the behavior during the actual treatment or sessions. We this far have just sort of taken a rough look at the individual variation of the children with cluster analysis. For example, here you can see that there's one cluster of children. This figure depicts the reading rate in consecutive training sessions. This group of children seem to have quite steady linear development, and they end up being actually pretty fast readers, a lot faster than they started with. But you have another cluster of children who don't seem to develop that much during the training. And when you look at the comprehension scores within the training program or during the training session, it seems that for the group that proceeds quite nicely from the point of reading rate, they maintain a very high level of reading comprehension also. But this other group performs at the end of these sessions really poorly. And I think that this really reflects that in our study we had a group of children who seemed to have really poor effort or poor concentration in independent practice. Well, this was kind of semi-independent practice because this was organized at schools by school assistants. So we have to take a closer look at the individual variation from the point of view of this concentration or how much effort they have put into practice and analyze the transfer into reading outside the training context from that point of view. And we are planning to collect a larger sample of children after this pilot study also. So I would say that the results seem promising, but we have to find out whether there's something in the sort of procedure of training that we need to pay attention to, or whether there are some sort of background factors related to the children that might explain the differences between or the large inter-individual variation in the effort and concentration. It might be, for example, that we have got a group of children with attention problems or additional attentional problems in our sample. Then just a few words about another project that we have been starting, and actually we are collecting data right now, which is related to motivation. In treatment studies, you typically find this phenomenon of treatment resistance, or poor transfer to everyday situations, or poor long-term effects. And on the other hand, we know that motivational factors are strongly related to learning. But these cognitive and motivational approaches are quite rarely combined in research, and even more rarely in treatment research. So our sort of bold aim is to try to find out whether self-efficacy beliefs moderate the effects of skill-specific training of reading or arithmetic fluency, and also whether this explicit support for self-efficacy and self-regulatory skills during training or during cognitive training, or on top of that, increase the effects of skill-specific interventions or transfer into everyday situations, or perhaps the amount of independent skill practice that children do outside the school setting. And the idea is based on, actually the concept is from Bandura's social cognition theory. Self-efficacy refers to one's beliefs in own ability to complete tasks and reach goals set. And what we are planning to do, we want to implement small group intervention sessions on top of this cognitive skill practice. And these small group intervention sessions, we try to support self-efficacy during the practice, skill-build practice. And basically the idea is to sort of emphasize and sort of underline positive feedback that will support motivation for learning and effort for practice and self-monitoring skills and task orientation and goal setting. And the idea is to we use the concepts of Bandura, like mastery experiences, which are the most sort of important source of self-efficacy, positive self-efficacy beliefs. But these small peer groups allow also vicarious experiences. You can see your peers develop, and you can discuss and give feedback to your peers who seem to be developing nicely, progressing nicely in their skills. You can get verbal persuasions, which is something that these children get probably quite little at school settings because they are the slowest in math and reading in their classrooms. And it's also one idea is to discuss the physical and emotional states that these problems and complex and difficult tasks cause for the children, and perhaps try to give new interpretations of these emotions and sort of physical experiences they have in different difficult tasks. We are also in the process of studying the effects of a reading support program, where we have elderly volunteers who have visited schools and given guided reading sessions with poor readers. And we are also developing means for assessing children's sort of reading practices outside of school setting, which is something that we know quite little of today. The preliminary findings show that the Finnish children from grade levels 1 to 6, the median score for weekly, or amount of weekly poor book reading is actually 0 minutes. So more than half of the children don't read books. They do read, but they read by watching television, they read blogs on the internet, they use these instant messaging systems, and I think we should know a bit more about the effects that these new media have on reading skills and sort of spare time consuming of the children. For example, in the latest PISA study, they asked children about the amount of spare time reading, but in PISA study, reading is reading books, and that's it. But it seems that the vast majority of reading children do nowadays is something else. It's not actually paper, it's electronic media they read. So that was a summary of what we are doing in the Department of Education and the Ilmäki Institute, and here you see my collaborators and colleagues that are working with me in this new project related to self-efficacy, for example. And I want to thank Professor Presnitz for allowing us to adapt and pilot the program, RAP program in Finnish. And as I mentioned, we'd be happy to continue our work with that and in our projects. And I'm looking forward to further cooperation. Thank you.
The pseudo words, but not in the real words.
Sorry?
What are the morphological properties that cause the effect you found for pseudo words and not for real words?
The reason why we didn't see the effect in text reading was that text consisted of words that did not include the practice items. So we had only, actually we tested only the transfer to pseudo words because we used infrequent syllables in our training to ensure that we see an effect on the syllables. And when you use infrequent syllables in Finnish, you can't really use them in words because the words would be infrequent also, and perhaps pseudo words for young children. So basically that's what we expected, and actually with a sort of larger set of syllables that would be more frequent, as for example in the Haifa study that was implemented within the grapher game, then you would expect to see effects also in text reading, but we didn't really measure that in our studies.
My question is comparing your data on the RAP training with the data we learned, I think, from Cincinnati. Was it Cincinnati? The Horowitz-Strauss data. If I get your picture right, you have some effects we call in Germany the Matthew effect. That is, those who are the better readers make more profit from the RAP training because the red lines in your slide started with a better, with a faster reading rate than the blue line would do not profit. And that seems to some kind be a contradiction to the results we were presented in the Horowitz-Strauss presentation. Is it right, or did I figure out the wrong data from the slide?
That's not what I wanted to say. I don't interpret the findings that way because they were all poor readers. They were below 10 percentile. But I think the group that don't seem to improve is a group that don't. They have hard time concentrating on the training. They sort of respond at random. They are sort of fed up. They don't like to do it. They are less motivated, and that's something that we have to look at more in detail, and also take a look at the transfer to reading tasks outside the training context and see whether you find the same sort of division between the children in the transfer also. And that's what I expect. We had a group of children, larger group of children who were motivated and liked the program and the practice. Then we had a group of children who volunteered for the practice, but they didn't have the effort and persistence to go through the 9 online sessions. That's my interpretation. But since these are preliminary findings, I want to be sort of cautious in interpreting in detail. But that's my guess at least. It looks like that.
One last question.
I wonder, given the big difference between your language and other languages, like our language, for instance, what does that actually mean about the brain and the ability of the brain to be similar in terms of the language network? Because it looks like you have the same network, and we have the same network for dealing with language, but the complexity of the input is so huge in your language compared to our language, for example, that it's really wondering if the same mechanism can handle this big difference. So what do you think about the brain itself? Like the network itself that deals with the language, could it be the same structures or the same mechanisms that deal with the same language? Because we know that in most of the languages it is actually operated in the same area.
It's not an easy question to answer, especially since I don't.
Sorry, I draw out the question.
I would sort of speculate that it's a question of sort of emphasis on certain processes. For example, in Finnish, the threshold of sort of becoming phonologically aware and master the phonological decoding is quite high in English because the grapheme phonic correspondence system is difficult. But when you master that, the language sort of supports your fluency development because the words are not inflected and you get to know these little words sort of by heart, orthographically or as whole words by practice. The difficulties in Finnish are on sort of different developmental dimensions. The first step is fairly simple because the Finnish phonological or Finnish orthography is so sort of lenient for beginning reader. It's fairly simple and children master it quite fast. They become independent decoders, but the problems in our case are more in the fluency sort of sphere of the reading development because words are long and complex. But I would guess that there's nothing sort of revolutionary different in the brain systems between the languages. These are, after all, both alphabetic orthographies.
So it's more developmental than something biological or regional. I mean, if you take an Israeli baby and put it on Finland, you will get the language and the network will develop to be familiar with this language. It will acquire the same
I'd
structure.
like to comment on that
networks.
point, actually.
Okay.
I think that the data from yesterday from Ken Pugh, and he's come back into the room now, but I'll defend him since he didn't hear the initial question. The data is suggesting that there's a core language network that's common across languages, and the input modality may differ, whether it's auditory or orthography. Once we get the information into that language processing network, what's happening in there is pretty similar across languages.
This is exactly the conflict. We all agree that there is some commonality in the network, but the deviation between the languages is so huge that it's really hard to believe it. And actually, I didn't thought about this until I heard this wonderful lecture showing me exactly how the language is developed. And then I started to understand that actually the deviation between this language and my language is so huge that it's hardly believing that the same network
There's some
will
studies,
adapt to the same.
some brain studies that have compared languages. The classic study, Paolo et al., for example, where they speak about the biological unity and cultural diversity. So they compare Italian and English. I don't recall what other languages. But on the brain level, the reading processes seem to be quite similar, more similar than you would expect from behavioral findings, actually.
Yeah, so we can continue this interesting conversation over lunch, and everybody's invited to have lunch, and we'll be back at 2 o'clock for the next session.
Thank you.